Hello and welcome to the Level 4 Certificate in Advanced Nutrition for Health, Weight Management and Sports Performance pre-recorded webinar on gut health for well-being and performance. I'm Ben Jones and I'm your tutor for this webinar. I helped to write the manual chapter on this topic, and my background is over 30 years working in the area of health, well-being and performance as a physiologist, personal trainer and educator. So I'm really interested in this area. It's obviously a really big topic at the moment, which everyone's interested in, and I'm going to guide you through some key aspects of it to give you a lot more of a basis in this area and some more confidence to talk to clients about it. This webinar is going to be in 4 parts. The first part is going to look at generally the effects of gut health on well-being and performance. And we're going to do some things like defining different terms, really understanding what the gut and gut health means, and then look at how that might have an impact on our health. The second part of this webinar is going to look at how exercise affects gut health. And really, it's not so much just how exercise affects gut health, but also how gut health affects performance. So it's a bi-directional relationship there. Third part of the webinar is going to focus on diet, which obviously is going to have an influence on the internal environment of the gut, which therefore will influence the health of all the microorganisms that live there, which is then going to have an impact on our health. Within that one, we're really going to cover off things like the signs and symptoms of gut problems as well, although that is touched on in the section on exercise too. So we'll be kind of working on that all the way through. And then part 4 really is going to be some top tips, methods to improve gut health, which obviously you can use for yourself and put into practice or give advice and guidance to your clients around that as well. Let's get into part 1. Looking at how gut health is going to influence our own health and well-being. When we start looking at this topic, there is a lot of terminology. It can get quite technical. So there are a few key terms that we really need to get right from the start, so that when we're looking at things like scientific research papers or reading articles or looking at social media posts by experts in this area, we can actually understand what they're talking about and what the differences are. Now, one of the key things that we will be looking at is this thing of microbiota. And the microbiota are the living organisms or living microorganisms within a defined environment. And we say defined environment because although we're going to focus mostly on the gut microbiota, the ones that live inside our digestive system, we have microbiota all over our bodies, as do all other animals and plants and pretty much everything else. So we're covered in microbiotas and microbiomes, and we kind of have these microfilms, which are thin layers, sometimes quite hard thin layers of microbiota that exist over different areas and cavities of the body, including the mouth, and the skin. So the microbiota are the living organisms. We mostly think about bacteria. We mostly hear about bacteria, good bacteria, bad bacteria in the gut, to kind of really oversimplify things. But this also includes other microorganisms, viruses, fungi, phages, and all these other little things that we might not really have heard of. But the bacteria is the main thing that is currently being studied. Now, the other term that is often used interchangeably with microbiota, but is slightly different, is the microbiome. Now, the microbiome doesn't refer to just the living microorganisms. It is all of the genetic material of microorganisms, including kind of broken down parts of those, metabolites, things that they get rid of when they're producing energy, and also other things in their environment. So the microbiome is broader, and it kind of refers to the whole area, the whole environment, and all of the genetic material in that, not just the living organisms, microorganisms that exist in that area. When we look at microbiomes, we see that there is a difference, they are all over us, but there's a different balance in the microbiota in different parts, different areas of the body. And even within the gut, and we'll look at this in quite a bit of detail, that they change through different areas of the gut based on that environmental condition. So the microbiome will affect and influence the microbiota that can live in it. And this is going to be kind of important. Now, there is a pretty solid relationship established, let me stop sharing for a second, between our gut and our brain. So this thing is known as the gut-brain axis, and this is one of the reasons why the gut microbiota are the main ones that are being studied at this point in time and are thought to be the one area that is probably most influential to overall human health. We have, obviously, our nervous system goes to all parts of our body, but there's a special part of the nervous system called the enteric nervous system, which is all the nerves that surround and innervate the gut. That is sometimes referred to as the second brain. And again, when people talk about things like gut instinct and having a visceral reaction to something, it's not really surprising because there is a very close relationship between this enteric nervous system and the brain. So there is a kind of a bidirectional relationship, and we can see that and feel that maybe when we're anxious or nervous and stressed, and we feel that in the gut, but also when we're feeling things in the gut, and that changes our own emotions or feelings up in the brain. So there's a relationship between the two. Now, when we start looking at things like the microbiota, we're going to talk about some numbers that are kind of staggering and quite hard to visualize. So it's been estimated, pretty accurately, that there are around 100 trillion microorganisms living in the human gut. Now, I don't know about you, but I struggle to visualize what 100 trillion of anything looks like. So I did a bit of digging, and if each microorganism was the size of a grain of sand, so still pretty tiny, but obviously, several orders of magnitude bigger than they really are, spread out, a layer of 1 grain of sand thick, that would cover 12.5 square miles. Which, if you think about scraping all that together and putting it on one beach, a nice little cove, a nice sandy little cove, that would be 1 microorganism for every grain of sand on that beach that you might go to on holiday. So again, trying to visualize that, it just shows it is staggering numbers of different things that are living inside of our bodies, inside of our guts. Now, when we look at this, we have around 1 trillion cells in the human body. So these microorganisms outnumber our own cells in the order of 100 to 1. So it shouldn't really be a huge surprise that, the fact that we've been living with these things all over us and inside us, for millions of years now, we have a relationship with these things, and they're going to influence how our body functions. There are a lot of them all over us, and especially in the gut. Now, this is known as a symbiotic relationship. So I'm just going to show you a bit of a silly clip, hopefully entertaining, and a very different kind of symbiote, but just to kind of get the concept of what a symbiotic relationship is like. So here's a bit of Tom Hardy in the Marvel movie Venom.
I have absolutely no problem with you sticking around, but if we do, we're gonna have to have some ground rules, all right? You cannot just go around eating anybody that you want to.
I cannot.
No, you cannot. All right, we need to reiterate this. There are good people in this world, a lot of them, and then there are bad people. You have to tell the difference. The deal is you will only ever be allowed to touch, harm, hurt, possibly, very possibly, eat very, very bad people, but never, ever, ever good people, all right?
Fine.
Good.
But how does one tell the difference?
It's super simple. I mean, you just have to, you can intuit it, you can sense it, sometimes you can even feel it.
Whatever you say. But can we get something to eat now? Otherwise, your liver, it's starting to look really, really good and juicy.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I know a place down here. Hey, Mrs. C.
How you doing, Eddie?
Ain't nothing changed but the weather, you know.
No.
So, what culinary delights will tickle the pickle tonight?
Tater tots and chocolate.
Right, okay, no problem.
The payment's due, Chan.
Please. I can't keep doing this.
Now.
Bad guy, right?
Yep.
You come in here again. In fact, you go anywhere in the city preying on innocent people and we will find you and eat both your arms and then both of your legs and then we will eat your face right off your head. Do you understand?
Please.
Yes. So you will be this armless, legless, faceless thing, won't you? Rolling down the street like a turd in the wind. Do you feel me?
What the hell are you?
We are Venom. On second thought.
Please.
That's probably enough of that. You get the idea. You can watch the movie if you want to see more. So obviously we're not like Venom, and we're not taken over by aliens. However, we do have a symbiotic relationship with the microorganisms that live in and on us. So particularly our gut microbiota. We are dependent on them for survival. They are dependent on us for survival. And it seems to be the case that the type, variety, number of different bacteria, particularly living inside our gut, can influence our behavior. And certainly, as we saw a little bit in the movie clip there, where Venom was trying to influence Tom Hardy's choice of food, they can influence our food choice, our microbiota, along with other things. So yeah, maybe not quite Venom, but not a million miles away either. So in reality, what does a symbiotic relationship look like for us? Well, Martin and et al. In 2020 have produced this diagram to show some of the relationships, particularly they were looking at athletes, but between gut microbiota and things like exercise and performance. And it's a bi-directional relationship. So, you know, the bacteria in our guts affect us and our health and our performance, but also us being active will then have an impact on them or our behaviors in general. Things like sleep, whether we smoke, drink alcohol, the food that we eat, all of these things will affect the health of the gut microbiota, and that therefore affects our health, and so on and so on. So it's a cyclical and symbiotic relationship. Now, when we look at relationships here, we can see that the exercise intervention studies that have been done in human indicate that when we do more physical activity, that changes the balance and diversity of the gut microbiota. And then more evidence coming from animal studies, so we have to interpret with a little bit of caution, but then suggests that the gut microbiota plays an important role in our physical performance, which could be down to things like the metabolic activity, and therefore them allowing us to harvest more nutrition from the food that we eat inside the gut, because it's not what we eat, it's what we absorb that will influence our performance. Some studies, observational studies, so again, not the strongest type of evidence, but they have observed that the metabolic activities and the pathways associated with things like amino acid and carbohydrate metabolism are increased in athletes compared to sedentary subjects. And we're going to look at these things a little bit more when we look at the exercise part of this webinar in particular. In the gut, one of the things that the bacteria in particular do, so not necessarily all the microorganisms, but the bacteria do, is they can ferment non-digestible carbohydrates, which is really just what we call fiber most of the time, different types of fiber. And they break these down into things called short-chain fatty acids, SCFAs. So you'll see that summary or that little acronym written quite a lot. Examples of short-chain fatty acids are things like acetate, propionate, and butyrate. And butyrate particularly is quite interesting in its effect on the brain. potentially. So it can do things like not just be used by the lining cells of the gut, of the colon, as an energy source, but also is thought to have an impact on things like neurotransmitter levels in the brain and boosting things like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which is a neurotransmitter associated with better cognition, brain function, learning, memory, these kind of things. So there's a mechanism there by which we could say, well, actually, yeah, these microbiota in the gut could be directly impacting or influencing how we feel and our kind of mental well-being. There's also then, kind of going back the other way, a suggestion from some recent studies that actually when people are doing anaerobic exercise, building up lactic acid or producing lactate to offset acidosis, some of that lactate gets into the gut through the circulation, which could give a more helpful environment to some of the bacterial species, the types of bacteria that actually like to live in a lactate-rich environment. So some bacteria like oxygen, some don't like oxygen. So some of the anaerobic bacteria like a lactate-rich environment, and actually that then might help those bacteria to thrive. And some of those bacteria are helpful ones, which produce things like the propionate, which then has a benefit back to us because propionate can be used in glucose synthesis in the liver. So that might improve energy availability and therefore improve performance. So, this little diagram here is just summarizing some of the kind of key changes that, when we exercise, that helps increase the richness, so the amount and different types of bacteria, particularly in the gut. A higher abundancy, so more of the beneficial types of bacteria, and these are just a few examples, and this advantage for some of the lactate using bacteria. That in turn then kind of gives us more of these short chain fatty acids and neurotransmitters, so that helps us feel better and perform better. That can help to maintain this kind of the barrier in the lining of the gut, so prevent a leaky gut. And we'll talk a bit about that as well as we go through this and why that can be problematic. There's a suggestion then that can help to boost the immune system and immune function, allow us to harvest more energy from the nutrients in the foods that we've eaten, and help regulate our muscle energy metabolism. So this kind of symbiotic relationship really does go both ways. So in summary, what do these microbiota do, particularly the bacteria, but all the microorganisms? Well, overall, we can say they're helping us to extract nutrients from the food we eat. We need them to help us break down the food in our gut to take out of that the nutrients that we need, and then we can absorb those from the gut into the bloodstream, process them in the liver, and then pass them around the body to where we need them. They help boost our immune function or regulate immunity in the body, and they help us then to break down and utilize the energy from nutrients effectively. In summary then of this section, let's just kind of define what we're talking about when we're talking about a healthy gut in kind of performance and well-being. Well, it's quite hard to define what makes up the healthy balance of different gut bacteria. And there are a few different reasons for that. This is quite still an early area of research. So although it's a very interesting area and there is a huge amount of research being done in this area at the moment, a lot of the findings conflict with one another. So it's not that all researchers are getting the same outcomes or same results when they're doing their studies in different areas. One of the challenges is that healthy people can have very different balances of bacteria in their guts. So you could have, 100 different people who are all perfectly healthy, fit, well, absence of disease, plenty of energy, sleeping well, eating decent diet, all the rest of it. And you kind of sample, a poo sample from all of them, and they've all got a different balance and amount of the different types of bacteria. So it's then very hard to draw clear conclusions as to, well, which of these bacteria are the particularly helpful ones, which ones are problematic, and what's the best balance to have of the different types, because it really does vary quite a lot. One of the other challenges we have with a lot of the research in this area at the moment is where we're sampling from. So as I've just kind of alluded to, most of the sampling research is done on fecal samples. So we're looking really at what's going on, you know, in the end product of digestion, and probably more reflective of the balance of microbiota in the large intestine, the colon, and kind of rectum. Now, that's not the same. We're going to see some diagrams later on to kind of explain this a little bit, but that's not the same as the balance of the microorganisms further up the gastrointestinal tract. And the gastrointestinal tract is about 26 foot long. So it's not a small tube. So if we've got a very different balance, you know, in the esophagus, to what's going on in the stomach, to what's going on in the small intestine, and the small intestine is kind of the area that's really important, because in the small intestine, this is where we're absorbing our nutrients from into the body. By the time, you know, the kind of the waste products pass into the large intestine, there is reabsorption of water, there is some transfer of nutrients there. However, most of the absorption of nutrients has already taken place. So the balance down there in the colon may not be that reflective of what's needed in the small intestine or what's healthy in the small intestine, and therefore a lot of the research that we're seeing is maybe not as helpful as it could be in terms of telling us what you know, that balance needs to be further up the GI tract. We do know some things for certain, and that is that people who are healthy have fewer of things like the pathogenic bacteria. So, you know, there are certain bacteria that we know are problematic, like Escherichia coli or E. coli, and Clostridium difficile, so C. difficile. So these are things that we know are kind of food poisoning bacteria. If you eat these, you're likely to get sick. You're probably going to get diarrhea and vomiting. Your body's trying to expel them and get rid of them because they will give you a nasty infection. So, you know, people who have healthy guts tend to have fewer of those bacterial strains. It probably includes more of the types of bacteria that are, you know, helpful to reduce inflammation. So bacteria that tend to reduce inflammation, the ones that produce these short chain fatty acids, and therefore, if they're doing that all the way through the gastrointestinal tract, we've got less inflammation of the gut lining. That means the gut lining isn't leaky, so we're not seeing so much transfer potentially of pathogenic bacteria, viruses, other things into the bloodstream. That's helpful for immunity, and therefore that's going to help to keep us healthier. And one of the other kind of observations that generally is made is that the healthiest people have the widest variety of different types of bacteria. And it seems to be the case that one of the things that helps to have a wide variety of different bacteria in your gut is to eat a wide variety of different foods in your diet. So especially plant-based foods, but eating a wide variety of different plants in your diet seems to correlate with having a wider variety of different bacteria in your gut. And therefore that seems to be a healthy thing to do. That brings us to the end of the first part of this webinar. I hope you've enjoyed it so far and it's kind of piqued your interest to want to get into a little bit more detail as we move into parts 2, 3, and 4. See you soon. Welcome back to part 2 of this webinar, where we're going to start looking at the relationship between exercise and gut health. Now, this is a really interesting, but by no means very advanced field of study. And there's a lot of research being done, a lot more research being done. And when we look at it, we find quite conflicting findings between different pieces of research. So all I'm going to say is, as we kind of proceed into this area of looking at exercise and gut health, proceed with caution. And there are a few examples here of why we need to be careful when we are talking to clients, participants about this sort of area, and why it's important not to be influenced maybe just by one study or the latest thing that comes out in the media, or that we see a post on social media and get all excited about, oh, exercise does this, that, and the other. When we're looking at an evidence base, we're looking at a broad base of all the research that's been done in an area. And when you have a lack of consistency, we need to then be very careful about what we are communicating on to other people and the level of confidence that sits behind that. So, for example, we've got some research that's been done which kind of highlighted in 2017 that where you've got people who are sedentary, so very inactive, doing maybe less than 30 minutes of moderate intensity activity per week, those people tended to have less richness, so fewer types of bacterial species, but also fewer bacteria overall in their gut, or in the stool samples anyway. But they didn't see, those researchers, an actual increase in the richness of the bacteria in people who are athletic compared to people who had a normal level of activity. So, there seems to be maybe something there that being active is good, but maybe exercising or being athletic on top of that doesn't seem to have an additional benefit. Whereas other studies then kind of looked at more specific groups. So we had a study, a bit of an older study, but looking at rugby players and then comparing, their gut health or the diversity of microbiota within their gut compared to, average population. And that showed that the rugby players had more bacteria and more variety of bacteria in their gut, which would indicate a healthier kind of gut microbiota. However, with something like that particularly, maybe there are other factors to consider. Yes, we're going to look at, diet and all these other factors, but particularly with a sport like rugby, where people are maybe spending more time outdoors than the average person and getting into the mud, where you've got a really rich variety of microbiota, the bacteria, then perhaps that's going to have a positive impact as well. So there's a lot of unknowns in some of these areas, some of these studies. Another study back in 2017 looked at cyclists trying to kind of get similar groups. So one group were recreational cyclists, another group were professional cyclists, comparing the gut bacteria between the two groups, seeing that the professional cyclists had a wider variety and amount of gut bacteria, sort of healthy gut bacteria. So again, that would indicate maybe that being more athletic does confer some kind of benefit. Then we kind of come on and look at some larger studies, a little bit more recent, where they're kind of comparing people across lots of different sports or athletic pursuits and trying to see, well, is there a pattern here? Any kind of comparison where people doing certain types of sport or activity, maybe they have a wider range of bacteria than people that do a different type of sport. And actually the conclusion of that one was that not really. And even more than that, the range and type of gut bacteria didn't seem to be particularly better than, or more beneficial than, the inactive controls. So there didn't really seem to be a particular strong relationship there in that study. But then other studies, again, slightly more recent, have shown that, athletes tend to have more of these kind of positive things. So these short chain fatty acids, which are something that is produced, metabolized by the bacteria in our gut, the healthy bacteria in our gut, when they break down things like fiber, they will produce these short chain fatty acids, and certain short chain fatty acids like butyrate, we know, are associated with better mental health. So these are going to be things that have a positive impact on the body. And also lower lipopolysaccharide. So this LPS, we're going to talk about quite a bit. LPS, lipopolysaccharide, is a substance that causes inflammation in the lining of the gut. So having high levels of LPS indicates that there's some kind of inflammation or stress in the gut lining. That can make the gut leaky, and that can then mean that more of these kind of pathogenic bacteria and other things that aren't particularly good for us get into the bloodstream. So obviously that's not great. So, when we're seeing that, we've got lower levels of this substance. Well, that's probably a good thing. That's protective of the body of health because it's giving a better barrier to these harmful bacteria and other substances compared to people who are sedentary. But again, that's a comparison between extremes. We've got the sedentary people who we know from that first study as well tend to have, worse bacteria in their guts, whereas, the athletes at the other end probably got some of the best. So there's definitely a connection there, but the connection, exactly what it is, and being very precise about which types of bacteria are beneficial and how exercise helps with that, we know maybe a little bit less of. So we're going to explore this topic and try and get into it in a little bit more detail, but do just bear in mind that none of this is 100% concrete. So it is an emerging area of study. Now, this diagram is taken from a really good paper, 2021 paper by Hughes and Holscher. You can look it up. It's Fueling Gut Microbes, a review of the interaction between diet, exercise, and the gut microbiota in athletes. So this is a paper, it's a free access paper. Can send you the PDF, or you can kind of just look that one up on Google Scholar. With this paper, we can have a little look at this diagram because it summarizes very nicely perhaps some of the relationships or interactions going on here between exercise and what's happening in the gut. So we're looking at kind of some different strategies here. As we kind of break it down then, we can see at the top of the diagram, you've got the nutrients. So the kind of things that people are eating. So obviously our macronutrients, protein, fat, and then carbohydrates. They've broken the carbohydrates down into a couple of types. So in the yellow font, maybe a little harder to read, it says high digestible carbohydrates. So those kind of easily digestible, maybe your more refined carbohydrates. Whereas then you've got in purple, the non-digestible carbohydrates and FODMAPs. So the non-digestible carbohydrates is fiber, basically. FODMAP is an interesting acronym. It stands for fermentable oligodimonosaccharides. So these are sugars, basically, but they're fermentable types of sugar. And polyols, which would then be the polysaccharide alcohols. So these are substances in foods which, can be used generally by the bacteria in the gut. For some people, too much of this can be a problem, and they can contribute to symptoms in people that have irritable bowel syndrome, irritable bowel disease or disorders. So it might be something that some people have been told to kind of steer away from or kind of keep a little bit lower, whereas in general, they might be things that are quite beneficial for our gut bacteria. And then probiotics are highlighted out here as well as being something else that we can eat. And probiotics being those kind of things that contain the living microorganisms. So things like certain yogurts and kefir, those kind of products that actually have the living microorganisms in them, as opposed to prebiotics, which would be the non-digestible carbohydrates and some of those oligosaccharides and things like that. So these are the foods that we're eating. Obviously, once we've eaten them, they get digested, broken down. So by the time they reach the gut, and it's looking here particularly at the large intestine, so it's gone all the way through stomach, being broken down and digested there, gone all the way through the small intestine. You've had your pancreatic juices and all those enzymes helping to break them down. Most of the nutrients have been absorbed by this point, and we kind of then have what's left sitting in the large intestine and the colon. So here we've got the kind of the byproducts of the nutrients, haven't we? We've got the amino acids, fatty acids, still, fiber, because that can't be broken down. And still those FODMAPs will still be there as well, and the probiotics. So those of them that survive, and we'll come back to this, but that's a really important point, is that when you consume probiotics, your digestive processes will destroy some of those. So not all of the probiotic that you eat is necessarily going to make it as far as your gut. And this is one of the perhaps limitations when people talk about probiotic supplements, is where there's a lot of question about how much of the active live ingredients in those will actually make it to the gut, and therefore be able to have any kind of positive impact. So down there in the gut, then what are they going to do? These different things. Well, we can see the amino acids are going to be have an effect on gut microbiota. So branch chain fatty acids, short chain fatty acids, phenols, and indoles. So these are some of the byproducts that will come from the amino acids there once the gut microbiota have had a chance to break them down and modulate them. The fatty acids can be converted into things like secondary bile acids. This one's a really interesting one, is the carbohydrates, the fiber, you're actually getting short chain fatty acids. So these really beneficial short chain fatty acids, amino acids, so proteins and fiber can be broken down into those in the gut by the bacteria. Gas, so again, if people are experiencing gut symptoms, maybe too much gas, perhaps that's almost too much fiber, so it can be a negative thing as well. Osmotic water, so we're going to get some fluids, water retention, and reducing the acidity, increasing the acidity with a lower pH in the large intestine. Probiotics, well, potentially, if they get there, are going to help with reducing that LPS, those lipopolysaccharides. So they're going to have to maintain this barrier function of the intestine, so stop too much of the pathogenic bacteria and other things leaking into the bloodstream, being absorbed. Antibiotic compounds, so obviously having a role there in the immune function and immune cell regulation. So they're doing quite a lot for us, these little bacteria in the gut. As we kind of look then what's happening with the exercise, there's questions over what happens to the gastrointestinal barrier function. Some of the studies showing that improves because of the lower LPS. Other studies show more signs of things like gastrointestinal distress. So, more bloating, more diarrhea, more discomfort with high intensity or high volumes of exercise. And this is one of the questions maybe that we have around exercise, is that although some could be beneficial, maybe too much or particularly very high intensities of exercise, perhaps that doesn't have such a good effect on the interior environment in the gut. So there's still a lot of question marks over this. Respiratory symptoms, glycogen storage, are they affected by what's going on in the gut? Certainly fuel utilization, we'll have a little look at in a minute, but it seems that metabolic pathways can be changed or affected by the influence of these gut microbiota. Micronutrients, so vitamin and mineral absorption. Again, if we are creating more of these different fatty acids, does that assist the absorption of certain vitamins? Are we kind of getting more of those if we're active and exercising? And then muscle function or hypertrophy. Some of these compounds might support muscle function or muscle growth. Others, potentially they could block that. So there's a kind of a circular relationship between exercise and what's going on there in the gut, because some of what's happening with the gut microbiota has the potential to affect our ability to exercise, and also exercising seems to affect the internal environment and therefore the health of the microbiota living in the gut. Moving away from thinking about the gut microbiota for a minute, when we are looking at exercise, as I just mentioned, some of those gut symptoms associated, particularly with high intensity exercise, are not necessarily helpful. And so particularly for running, it seems to be running that is the one that often gets mentioned and brought up or highlighted, and perhaps that is just due to the action, the movement, the impact of that particular activity as well. But there's a common observation, common experience amongst runners that it does tend to have an impact on gastrointestinal symptoms. So what can you do to try and work on that and try and reduce the impact of those symptoms on performance, because they can have a negative impact on performance? Well, there are a few strategies. There are a lot of researchers in this area, but Asker Jukendrup seems to have done a lot of the research and kind of come up with a lot of these guidelines. And so you can see more of this detail in your manual. However, we've got some key strategies that he's identified. So you can do things like gradually training to increase the amount of particularly sports drinks, but fluids that you can cope with in your gut. So, if you're not used to going out and running and drinking things like sports drinks, you started to do some longer runs over maybe 60, 90 minutes where you need those kind of things, because for shorter activities don't. If you suddenly just start trying to take on board loads of this, it is likely to create gastrointestinal distress. You're likely to get an upset stomach. You're likely to have stomach cramps. You're likely to feel nauseous, potentially get diarrhea. So to avoid that, rather than just suddenly gulping down a load of drinks, progressively building up the volume of those types of products that you're using over time whilst you're doing your training is the way forward. So you can use that as a strategy, gradually increasing the volume strategically to let your stomach get used to it and increase the rate of gastric emptying. So that's what a lot of this comes down to, is how quickly can your body release the fluid and the sugar from the stomach while you're exercising. And if you're not used to eating or drinking whilst exercising, your body's not used to doing that. So it's not going to do it very easily. It'll kind of sit there, or it'll come back up. Whereas if you gradually acclimatize your body to taking on board fluid or even food whilst you're doing your exercise sessions, it will get more used to that, and it will speed up how quickly it empties that carbohydrate into your small intestine, so you don't then get those kind of sloshing and cramping and stitch and all those horrible symptoms or signs as a result of that as well. So another strategy might be to increase your glucose intake. So this doesn't have to be done for a really long time. It could just be 3 to 7 days before an event or a competition. Having a higher carbohydrate intake over those, that week gets your body used to clearing the carbohydrate out of the stomach quicker. So then when you get to the event, your body's still used to doing that. So that'll just speed up rate of gastric emptying. Therefore, you're getting less symptoms. For those doing things like ultra endurance, you wouldn't normally be taking on board fat during exercise unless you're doing some kind of ultra event. But for those doing those kind of activities, you can also speed up the rate at which your stomach empties fat. And that is by doing a similar thing, but it takes a longer time for the body to kind of get used to that and acclimatize to that. So as I say, there's a full table with more detail of different strategies and how they supposedly work in the manual, but that gives you an overview of some of the key strategies that can be used to try and train the gut for exercise. So here we go. This is back to this kind of concept that, when we're looking at all of these different studies, we have to be a bit careful in terms of, the interpretation and what's actually going on. What's the validity? Are we really looking at what we think we're looking at? So when we're looking at the kind of the gut, there's a couple of terms that are added in there. So a lot of it is this sort of concept of functional capacity. And this also comes back to the difference between microbiota and microbiome. So the microbiome might be more relevant because that's considering the environment and all these other little metabolites, as well as the bacteria and the other organisms that are living in there just themselves. So the functional capacity then looks at, what's the ability of all of this in the microbiome to actually help process or modulate the food and the nutrients that are going in there. And this might be more useful. So going forward, when we're looking at research papers in this area, rather than just focusing on the bacteria or the microbiota, I think what we're likely to see is more of a focus on the microbiome and the functional capacity overall, which is going to look at obviously all of the different genetic material across all of those organisms and the environment and the little breakdowns and the metabolites, rather than just those bacteria or the organisms themselves. So this is important because there are more than one thing in there that can do the same job. So perhaps some of the limitations that we've seen so far with the research is that, where there's variation and you've got, a few healthy people, and some of them have more of one bacteria, others have more of another bacteria, but they both seem to be perfectly healthy and their gut's doing the job well. Well, that could be because more than one bacteria and also some viruses and also some of these just random metabolites that are floating around, they're all able to do the same job. They can perform the same function. So it's more that function that's important rather than specifically which bacteria and how many of them. So the functional capacity concept is something that is going to become more of a focus and more relevant going forward in the research. So we might have an example of that in that carbohydrates could be metabolized by Prevotella, which is a type of Bacteroidetes bacteria, or Ruminococcus from the Firmicutes phylum of bacteria. So you've got two different types of bacteria, but they can both break down carbohydrates. They both do the same job. So one person could have more Prevotella, one's got more Ruminococcus, and then, it doesn't really matter which they've got more of. They're both doing the same function. So as long as you can perform that function in the gut, then, you're okay. Similar things for, some of the bacteria that break down into short chain fatty acids as well. So there's a lot of other factors, as you can see on this slide, that will also have an influence on the functional capacity of someone's gut. And so then it makes it very, very difficult when you're looking at a study that's trying to see, for example, the effect of exercise on gut health. It's very hard to tell, well, what's due to the exercise itself and what could be due to any of these other factors or a combination of these other factors. So that could be genetics. It could be down to the way that somebody was born. So, in a natural birth, we actually pick up some of the bacteria from the mother's vaginal tube passage, and that actually then goes into our own microbiota, kind of a bit of a starter kit for microbiota. Whereas if you're born by cesarean, you miss out on that. So, it's then you haven't got the same maybe level of innate immunity when you're acquired passive immunity as you're coming out. Again, breast milk versus formula, completely different. Yeah, so a formula might provide similar macronutrients. It's giving the right amount of energy. It's got some of the amino acids, the proteins that the babies need, the fat and the carbohydrate. However, it's not got any of the bacteria and any of these other important hormones and other things that might be very, very useful to developing a healthy microbiota or microbiome. Age, there's going to be natural changes through the life cycle. Diet, we're going to come on and look at in detail in a minute. Also, other lifestyle choices. So, we know smoking is not good for us. It also is going to have an impact on our microbiome, microbiota. It's going to affect the health of the bacteria and the other organisms living in there as well. Similar with alcohol and use of other drugs, including medications. So again, where some people maybe respond better as well to a medication than others, now that is thought to be linked to the gut microbiota and microbiome. So why does one person respond better to, for example, an antidepressant, whereas someone else doesn't respond very well to it? That could link back to their microbiota and microbiome. Again, where you live, that's going to have an impact. That's why I mentioned, with the rugby players study earlier, very interesting. If people are spending more time interacting with nature, being more exposed to a wider variety of bacteria from different plants, animals, that kind of environment, versus living in an urban environment, which is, relatively sterile or maybe has higher proportion of pathogenic bacteria, viruses, those kind of things from other people, but doesn't have perhaps some of the other bacteria to balance out, the healthier ones, then that's going to have an impact on health as well. And then if we have to take antibiotics, and hopefully you're aware of the concept of antibiotic resistance. So as time's kind of gone by, antibiotics have obviously been used as life-saving medicines, very, very valuable, but potentially been overused, kind of given out to people when they didn't really need them. over time, some of these pathogenic, the bad bacteria strains that make us ill, have got used to antibiotics, and they've almost evolved to become resistant. Well, they have evolved to become resistant to those antibiotics. So the antibiotics that we have available to us now are becoming less effective on some of these, antibiotic resistant strains like MRSA. So if you have to take antibiotics, only take them if you really need them. If you have to take them, they're not very selective. They're not usually, most antibiotics don't just pick on one type of bacteria, the bad ones. They will just very blanket kill lots and lots and lots and lots of your bacteria, including the commensal bacteria, the healthy bacteria that are living in your gut. So once you've taken a course of antibiotics, it's really important to try and build back up those healthy bacteria again, because otherwise what can happen is you're almost more susceptible then to getting another infection, because if you become into contact with some pathogenic bacteria and you don't have as many of the healthy ones already sitting there in the gut to kind of fight them off and work against them, you're more likely then to get ill. So again, things like antibiotics can have quite a devastating impact in the aftermath on the microbiome. But obviously, if you need them, they're essential. So don't not take them if you need them. When we're looking specifically at exercise, then, as we say, a lot of different studies all showing slightly different things. Interpret with caution. But it does seem, with the more recent studies, you'll see these ones are kind of newer than the ones we were looking at before. It does seem that, that there's a generally positive impact. So we know that exercise in general does improve health through lots of different mechanisms on the body. We know that exercise tends to reduce inflammation throughout the body. So it's doing that. So maybe it's doing that in the gut as well. Some studies, again, this McGettigan one in 2022 did show that, a program of longer than 12 weeks can have anti-inflammatory effects, which is due to positive impact or positive effects on the gut microbiota. So again, maybe some of the earlier studies were conflicting. If the duration of the intervention in the study was not long enough, maybe it just takes a little bit longer to have these positive effects on the gut health. But when we see maybe higher levels of exercise or higher intensity exercise in athletes, this is where it gets a little bit grey, because exhaustive exercise, exercising to exhaustion, obviously very high intensity, disrupts the balance of the gut microbiota and impairs the immune system. And we've seen that observation before. We'll look at this again in the presentation on immunity. Too much exercise or a high volume of exercise, high intensity of exercise has been associated with suppressing immune function. So maybe that's got something to do with it. Maybe that's mediated through the gut as well. Very intense exercise, as we talked about a little bit earlier, creates this kind of gastrointestinal distress. Well, that can actually increase those lipopolysaccharides and create a leaky gut. So again, exercise in general, being more active, is shown associated with lower LPS, a better gut barrier, but maybe very high intensity exercise does the opposite, at least in the short term after the session. So if you're an athlete or you're doing lots of very high intensity exercise, maybe that's going to create a more negative impact on the barrier there, stopping things getting into your body. And again, observation, correlation maybe, but professional athletes do experience immune suppression and higher rates of gastrointestinal symptoms than the normal population, general population. So, this is where perhaps there's a difference between the benefits of being physically active, the benefits of doing regular exercise, versus being an athlete where, and we know often athletes and performance is not synonymous with health. It's not the same thing as exercising for health. Maybe it's pushing things to a higher level, and perhaps that level of stress on the body. Exercise is a form of physical stress, particularly if they're not able to recover fully from those exercise stresses. On balance, that could be having more of a detrimental impact to the gut microbiota or microbiome in that period of time. So what is it that determines whether it's a good thing or a bad thing? It does seem to be the intensity. So when athletes engage in prolonged or intense exercise, they do have high levels of the types of bacteria that are associated with inflammation. So different types of bacteria that are kind of more associated with, we see more of them when things are inflamed there in the gut. So, this would be potentially disadvantageous because of more of that LPS that we've talked about. And again, some of the good bacteria that usually help our health, like Faecalibacterium, which is one of those ones that produces the short chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate, which is helpful because it goes on to make GABA, which is a neurotransmitter in the brain. Those would be more abundant. Again, it's a little bit conflicting. You've got more of one thing but less of another in terms of what's good or not so great for our health. So what should we be doing? Well, being fit is clearly beneficial. So a higher VO2 max, increased aerobic capacity, definitely seems to have a benefit. Certain bacteria like Akkermansia there improves the body's ability to break down and use fats, lipids or fats for fuel. Well, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because you think if you're doing a lot of particularly maybe like your zone 2 aerobic cardiovascular conditioning, that is relying on fat as an energy substrate. So it would make sense that we're adapting to be more efficient at using fat. Well, perhaps one of the ways that happens is through an adaptation in the gut bacteria that helps us to do that. So that's probably a good thing. Again, fitter people tend to have, fewer of those pathogenic bacteria in the gut. Whereas all of these benefits seem to be associated more with the aerobic exercise. There doesn't seem to be much variation, if any, in people that do regular resistance training compared to the general population. So again, in terms of gut health and what we might want to advise our participants, clients will have a positive impact on the gut health, that would seem to be more of the aerobic type activities. And again, probably more moderate to vigorous aerobic activities rather than HIIT training or very extreme duration kind of aerobic exercise. And obviously, we still want to do resistance training for many, many other reasons, all the benefits it gives us, but doesn't seem that probably resistance training is going to have much of an impact in terms of gut health. So lots covered off there, hopefully lots of food for thought. In terms of practical tips, there's not a huge amount there, for what you can go away and directly use this information for with clients. I'd say probably the most useful bits are around how to train your gut. So if you are working particularly with endurance athletes and people that are trying to increase the duration of their exercise capacity, then that's where those strategies for trying to manage gut distress comes. But in terms of general health, again, maybe reassuring those clients, participants that are looking to exercise just for their own general health and well-being. They're not interested perhaps in performance or a particular sport pursuit. Reassuring those people, look, you don't have to be going out there killing yourself when you're exercising. You don't have to be going really, really hard every session. That's actually maybe detrimental to your overall health and well-being in the long term, and particularly kind of your gut health. So, carry on, do your regular exercise, but it can be at a comfortable aerobic intensity that is going to be valuable and beneficial in terms of your health and well-being. And then on the other side, with athletes, if we are working with people who are training at these very high intensities, then maybe it's more important to look at some of our other strategies for recovery, and particularly looking at diet and nutrition to offset some of these potential negative impacts, where people, are seeing maybe an increase in things like the LPS, a little bit of elevated inflammation in the gut after high intensity sessions. Or if we're working with people who are training for, a marathon or an ultra event, and doing this very prolonged exercise, again, what are the kind of the nutritional strategies we might be able to use to try and offset some of the negative impacts of that, as well as reducing potentially unpleasant gastrointestinal symptoms that those people might be having. All right, so hopefully that's been of interest. That's part 2 of 4. And in the next section, we're going to move on to part 3 and look more at nutritional strategies for improving gut health. See you then. Welcome to part 3 of the webinar. And this is where we're really going to start looking at how diet affects our gut health. Within this one, although we've already touched on it a little bit, we're going to look at signs and symptoms of gut problems. So we did briefly talk about that within the context of exercise, particularly around athletes doing intense or prolonged endurance exercise. But here we're going to look at that a little bit more generally as part and parcel of how diet influences our gut health. So in this area, there are more terms, which again, I think I touched on these in the section on exercise, but these are really important terms. So when we talk about gut health, you very often hear about prebiotics and probiotics. And it's important to know which is which and why that matters. So a probiotic is some kind of product that contains live ingredients, live microorganisms. Most often, we hear about bacteria. So, started off with those little yogurt drinks and the varieties of those yogurts now and other products which kind of promote themselves as having these healthy bacteria in. Well, to be fair, yogurt always has had some, but what they've done is identified certain strains of bacteria that are thought to be healthy and therefore increased those within their products. There are now a wider and wider range of probiotic supplements available. And although some of these will have some evidence behind them, a lot of them haven't. So again, we'll come on and talk about supplements and scope of practice and where we sit around that, but always be very, very cautious when something is promoting or advertising probiotic supplements in terms of actually how useful is that going to be. It might be that there are several thousand of these living probiotics in their supplement, but when you kind of look at that in the context of the 100 trillion organisms there in the gut, how much impact is that really going to make? It's like pouring a glass of something into the ocean. It's not really going to have much impact. So again, we need to treat that with a little bit of healthy skepticism, let's say. Prebiotics, these are not living organisms. These are not bacteria or anything like that. These are the things that the bacteria feed on, particularly kind of the healthy gut microorganisms. What are they using? What are they breaking down and metabolizing as part of their metabolic pathways that produce things in the gut that are helpful for us, particularly? So prebiotics are the things that the bacteria are eating. Now, this is much easier because they're not alive, so we don't necessarily have to worry about them. Do they manage to pass through the digestive system and get to where they're needed, still alive and functioning? And that's why, in some ways, prebiotics are an easier side of the coin rather than looking at the probiotics. So probiotics, naturally, we've got foods that are probiotic. So as I mentioned, kind of a lot of dairy foods, so yogurt in particular. Milk itself isn't that probiotic, but it's the fermentation process that is important. So fermented milk products. So yogurt, kefir, which you may or may not have come across, kind of is quite higher than yogurt usually in probiotic bacteria, and then some cheeses as well. Pasteurization often will kill a lot of the bacteria or destroy a lot of the bacteria. So again, a lot of the products that we are buying on supermarket shelves may not be as high in the kind of the healthy bacteria as traditional versions of these foods. However, they're also much less likely to have pathogenic bacteria, which could kill us. So there is a definite benefit to pasteurization in terms of public health. However, from a kind of a microbiome impact, it will potentially have an impact on how much benefit they can have as well. It's not just the dairy foods. Some fermented plant foods also contain probiotics, so living microorganisms. So kimchi is a Korean, very nice spicy kind of pickle, which is very tasty, but also full of these bacteria. Sauerkraut, again more of a German European origin, but a similar thing. So kind of pickled cabbage. Pretty much any kind of pickles, to be fair, where there has been a fermentation process as part of the production of that food will be, have some probiotics in them. And then again, a lot of our kind of traditional Asian foods like tofu or tempeh, which is fermented bean curd, and miso as well, which also is another kind of delicacy or soup. So these are Japanese soup. So you've got a lot of different options there, which can all have some probiotics. I suppose if you're eating some of these foods on a regular basis, the idea is that is going to boost maybe the good bacteria or the commensal bacteria that seem to be associated with good gut health a little bit more than if you're not getting any of those foods on a regular basis. So including those in our diets may be helpful. And a lot of them have other nutritional qualities as well, values that are going to be helpful. On the prebiotic side, so these are the kind of not containing the living organisms, but are the important thing that those gut bacteria need to live on, is different types of fiber primarily. So insoluble fiber and soluble fiber and oligosaccharides. So type of sort of polysaccharide that can't easily be broken down. So particularly the fructooligosaccharides, things that are coming from fruits. So the best guidance really is to get your prebiotics, eat a wide variety of different plant foods. And that's where we're going to come on to later, really, as a kind of key message. Now, I've alluded to this a little bit earlier, and we'll come on and kind of look at why this is part of the challenge when it comes to interpreting research and being cautious with interpreting research in this area. But the digestive system, as you know, is not the same all the way through. And the conditions, sort of environment within each part of the digestive system really does change quite a lot. And so a lot of this information is coming from a paper by Kennedy in 2020. And again, you can look that one up. That paper is called The Microbiome, Composition and Locations. And you've got the reference in your manual for that one for sure. And this is a really helpful diagram, I think, that helps us to understand how the environment of the GI tract changes as you go through it, and why that changes or has an impact on the types and number of different bacteria, but obviously probably all the other microorganisms as well, although they're less well studied. So we're going to just take our little journey step by step through the gut and have a little bit of a consideration of how that impacts what's going on there. Now, the oral cavity or mouth has something like 200 to 2,500 unique bacterial species. So again, that's a lot of variety and variation from one individual to another. So this is a huge range, over tenfold range, and that is going to be down to the individual and a lot of their lifestyle and genetic factors. I've mentioned the word biofilm a few times. So a biofilm is kind of a layer of microorganisms, microbiome, that exists over the surface of one of your body surfaces. So there's a microfilm or a biofilm over skin, inside all our different kind of body cavities, and that is including the mouth. A really good example of this is that plaque, which you're probably familiar with, in the mouth, is a type of biofilm. So this is where, the biofilms aren't necessarily just soft little things that can be brushed away or wiped off. Sometimes they can build up and become quite hard and form a permanent layer over the top of our body surfaces like tooth enamel. So plaque obviously can have a detrimental impact to oral health if it's building up, and that's because of the balance of the different bacteria in the mouth. And some research has even shown that some of the bacteria, that if we have them in high levels in the mouth, we get more oral problems, so more tooth decay, more gum disease, more plaque formation. there's an association between that and cardiovascular disease. Because some of those bacteria also more generally cause inflammation throughout the body. And we know that inflammation is the root cause of damage to the arterial linings, which then causes a lot of our cardiovascular problems. So there seems to be a link here. You know, the microbiome is important. So we've got, again, differences within the mouth. The types of bacteria that are found on the external surface of the teeth are different to the ones found on the internal surface of the teeth. The bacteria at the front of the mouth seem to be a little bit different in balance to the ones that are found at the back of the mouth, more one in one area than another. But generally, unsurprisingly, you find more bacteria that are aerobic, so they use oxygen in their metabolic pathways to survive in the mouth than you do further down the GI tract. So that's going to be a trait or a characteristic that we'll notice. You see here on the diagram talking about oxygen. You know, this is going to be the highest. This is as high as it gets. As we go further down, there'll be less and less, you know, oxygen available, and therefore fewer and fewer bacteria that rely on aerobic metabolism. So this is going to be one of the big drivers of the change in balance of different types of bacteria and organisms as we travel through the GI tract. Again, a lot of these bacteria in the mouth are anti-pathogenic. So they are, you know, antimicrobial, as it says here, the sort of pink line. They're attacking bacteria, they're attacking viruses. So they are there primarily to try and, you know, help keep us healthy, you know, get rid of some of these potential infection-causing microorganisms before we can even swallow them. Again, in terms of pH, so it's quite alkaline in the mouth. It's not particularly acidic, so quite high pH level. And again, there's not a very thick layer of mucus in the mouth. We've got saliva, but it's not a particularly thick layer of mucus there. And food's not staying in the mouth very long. You know, we should probably chew, most of us, for a little bit longer than we do. But even if you're chewing thoroughly, you know, the food isn't there for a long time. Moving on, the next section of the GI tract is the esophagus. And really, there's not huge change here. There's very limited research being done on this area of the GI tract in terms of the microbiome. Food isn't here for very long. It is just the tube that gets it from, you know, the point of being swallowed to in your stomach. And that's where the action really starts to happen. So there's not a lot happening. Transit time's pretty quick. And actually, the balance of bacteria is pretty much the same as what's in your mouth. There's no real change. Stomach is where it starts to get interesting, because as you already know, there's a real difference in the stomach conditions. So the environment in the stomach is very acidic. So again, just to correct, because I made a bit of a kind of a fluff earlier with the whole pH thing. So the lower the pH, the more acidic an environment is. The higher the pH, the more alkaline the environment is. So we've gone from a fairly alkaline, high pH in the mouth, and now all of a sudden in the stomach, we've got this very strong hydrochloric acid, which is making it a very low, very acidic environment. So that's beneficial because it destroys a lot of bacteria. It's a very harsh environment for a living microorganism. So, you know, the idea of having, you know, one of the reasons we've evolved to have very acidic stomachs is to stop us getting ill. A lot of these pathogenic bacteria that cause illness will be destroyed in the stomach, you know, because of that acidity. However, not all of them. And some of them will, you know, about 65%, it's estimated, of the bacterial load. So the different types of bacteria that are found in the mouth, about 65% of those different types manage to get through the stomach without being destroyed. So we are, you know, we're killing off some of them, probably a lot of the aerobic metabolizing bacteria as well. But we're still getting quite a bit of variety or diversity of bacteria getting through the stomach. There is one particular bacteria of note when we're kind of looking at what's going on in the stomach, and that is this Helicobacter pylori, which at one point was fairly revolutionary when they first sort of discovered this bacteria in the stomach. of people with stomach ulcers. And it went from the explanation and the mechanism of what causes stomach ulcers, previously originally was thought to be down to high levels of acidity or very acidic environment in the stomach, causing basically burning the lining of the stomach, maybe the mucus not being thick enough or something going on like that. And then this bacteria was discovered in an incredibly high proportion of people that have stomach ulcers, and that association was made that actually maybe it's something to do with the presence of this bacteria. So now, as research has gone on in that area, it's been seen that actually only about half of the people that have Helicobacter pylori in their stomach actually get stomach ulcers. So maybe it's not as simple as, well, if you've got presence of this bacteria, that's guaranteed going to cause a stomach ulcer, because it doesn't do it for everybody. So again, there seems to be something about the behavior of that bacteria, and it's only a problem if that bacteria then finds a way. It's a little bit like a drill, a part of this bacteria. If it finds a way to drill into the lining of the stomach, that's where it's going to kind of start killing off some of these mucosal bacteria and reducing stomach acidity, and then that's going to cause your stomach ulcer, your problems. So it's not everybody that's going to experience that. And I guess the future of the research will be, well, what makes that happen in some people but not others? But we do know that perhaps some of the previous treatments, like your antacid type treatments, reducing the acidity of the stomach, they may cause more problems than they solve. So again, the cardiac sphincter, the little donut of muscle that closes the top of the stomach off from the esophagus, part of what tells that to close is a difference in the level of acidity. So the esophagus is fairly alkaline, the stomach obviously is very acidic, and that difference is what keeps that muscle closed. So if we reduce the acidity in the stomach, actually that can become a little bit leaky, and then you get some of the stomach acid, the chyme, bubbling up into the esophagus. That's where you can get esophageal ulcers, gastroesophageal reflux disease. That can be even more problematic for people. So so some of these kind of proton pumps and other medications may not all necessarily be the most helpful thing for those conditions. Once the chyme passes out of the stomach, gets into the small intestine, the bacteria in that chyme and in that area, that environment of the stomach, are now different again. Things are starting to change. So Donaldson et al. Sort of describe it as, compared to the large intestine, so further down in your colon, the small intestine is more aerobic, so not all of those aerobic bacteria have been destroyed, more acidic, which makes sense, because we've got the chyme from the stomach, which is quite acidic, and secretes higher levels of antimicrobial molecules, which makes sense again, doesn't it? Because we're still trying to kill off those things that would make us ill if they get into our bloodstream. Because at this point, the food hasn't been absorbed into the bloodstream. We don't really start absorbing nutrients until we're in the small intestine, until the food's in the small intestine. So we still want those kind of antimicrobial type bacteria. And it has a shorter transit time. So again, this just means that the chyme is moving fairly quickly through the small intestine, whereas once it gets to the large intestine, what's left is just going to sit there for a bit of a longer time. So it's a kind of hard area to get to. So researching what happens in the small intestine is challenging. And this goes back to something I said probably in part one of this webinar around, why we have to be maybe a bit cautious with some of the research in this area, where it's looking at the balance of different types of bacteria, because most of the research that's done in this area is being done using fecal samples. So that's telling us about the balance of the bacteria in the large intestine, in the rectum. That's not really telling us too much about the balance of bacteria up here in the small intestine. And it's really important, actually, what's going on in this small intestine, because this is where absorption takes place. This is where nutrients are being absorbed from. And this is where, if we have got those lipopolysaccharides and inflammation, that might be causing issues in terms of what's getting absorbed into the body or not getting absorbed into the body. So we've got a lot of different things going on here. We don't know as much about how it works. However, we do know that there seems to be some influence of the different types of microbes in this part of the gut, which influence circadian rhythms. So where people are maybe struggling with their sleep-wake cycle, having problems with sleeping, it could be linked to this. I mean, there's a lot of other factors in modern life that have a negative impact on sleep-wake cycles as well, probably starting with blue light, screen use, those kind of things. But we know that sleep and sleep patterns are implicated in the development of conditions like obesity and type 2 diabetes. So again, it might be another area that's kind of interesting to look at, or consideration in terms of maybe what we're eating, when we're eating, and how that might then influence activity or balance of bacteria within this part of the gut, and whether that could be having an impact as well on the quality and timing of our sleep. So there's some really interesting kind of considerations around here. As you can see on the screen, still fairly aerobic, but reducing the amount of oxygen, the amount of aerobic bacteria. The bacterial load, which got quite small in the stomach, is now increasing again as we're getting into this part of the bacteria. So it actually just means we're building up the amount of different bacteria. The pH is coming up again. So after being very, very acidic in the stomach, we've now got the bile and the kind of pancreatic juices that are being kind of injected into this part of the gut. So pancreatic juices are quite alkaline, so they will start to reduce the acidity and raise the pH again. Mucus is moderately thick. So, so we've got a sort of reasonable, and it's the mucus where these bacteria live. So the mucus layer is where these bacteria are going to live. So the thicker the mucus layer, the more of a place there is for them to stay. So you're more likely to have an increased number of variety of bacteria. So that kind of links to the increased bacterial load, because there's a decent amount of mucus for them to live in. Antimicrobials are reducing, but still quite high. So we've still kind of got a lot of pathogen fighting bacteria here. And the transit time is fairly quick, but slowing down as we get to the lower part of the small intestine. So here we are at the colon, or the large intestine, and this really is where most of the research has been done, as we say. So it's the best studied part of the gut. It's interesting because that's relevant for a few reasons. One, because it's the easy bit to study because we can get the fecal samples. But two, because actually this is where bacteria really thrive. So it is thought that actually what's happening down here is going to have quite a strong influence on our health. And you can see the mucus thickness here is a lot thicker. So there's more places for these bacteria to live. The bacterial load, therefore, is increasing, and the pH becomes more and more alkaline as it kind of carries on through there. There are fewer of the antimicrobials, because at this point it's less about trying to fight off pathogenic bacteria. We're not absorbing a huge amount across the lining of the colon. We're reabsorbing water, particularly, and then we're absorbing some of these small molecules that we're going to talk about in a minute, but this isn't really the main site of absorption in the gut. That's the small intestine. So again, and the transit time is slower, so the bacteria in this area are hanging around for longer, so that means they can have more of an effect on our health because they're in the body for longer, or passing through the body for longer. So, they're thriving. The main thing that's going on here is the synthesis of these short chain fatty acids. And again, I think it's, I find it fascinating that we're making fatty acids, fats, from fiber, from a carbohydrate, which is a non-digestible carbohydrate. We can't break it down like normal polysaccharides and absorb it in the small intestine. It just passes through that part of the gut. Once it's here, it can be fermented essentially, it can be broken down by these bacteria, and some of the metabolic byproducts from the bacteria doing their metabolism to keep themselves alive is these short chain fatty acids. So that's their kind of byproducts, waste products. But they're not waste products to us. We absorb those short chain fatty acids because they're small molecules. We can absorb those across the lining of the large intestine. And actually they account for something like 5 to 15% of our total energy requirement for the day. So depending on who we are, depending on how much fiber we're getting, all of these various different kind of individual differences, somewhere in the order of 5 to 15% of our energy needs per day is met by these short chain fatty acids, which are only produced because of bacteria in the gut breaking down fiber. So we can have a think about what the impact of a diet that maybe is very low in fiber might be, especially when we know that these short chain fatty acids, particularly some of the butyrate producing ones, can have really beneficial effects on compounds then in the body, like certain neurotransmitters. So again, there's some really interesting areas here in terms of what might happen if we're getting enough or too little of something in the diet, how that might affect the prevalence of certain bacteria, and then what impact that might have on our health as well. And it is a bi-directional relationship. So we can see that, if we are in a state of inflammation, chronic stress, for example, in the body, and we're perhaps not sleeping well, we're not eating particularly healthily, maybe we're doing things in our lifestyle which are promoting inflammation in the body, that has a negative impact on the amount and type of bacteria in the large intestine, which is then going to reduce their ability to produce those compounds which improve our health and reduce inflammation. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle. Whereas we know that if we are perhaps avoiding lifestyle factors that damage those bacteria, we are engaging in, the moderate aerobic exercise, we are eating a healthy diet with a wide variety and balance of different plant foods, that's going to improve the health and the variety of these bacteria in our gut, which in turn are then producing these compounds which are going to boost our own health and well-being. So it's more of a virtuous cycle. So it's really important that we are kind of being aware of the impact of our own behaviours on the health of not just us as an organism, but our microbiota as well. So in summary then, like Beam in 2021, et al. Had a look at this and they kind of summarised, well, what are the impact of different foods on what is termed dysbiosis? So DYSBIOSIS, dysbiosis, which just means an imbalance or an unhealthy change in the mixture of the types of bacteria and other microorganisms that are living in the gut and throughout the body, really. So Beam summarised that, there are some key differences between a standard Western diet, which is high in ultra-processed foods, versus a kind of a whole food, more plant-based diet. And that doesn't mean necessarily having to be vegetarian or vegan, but just having a lot of plant foods within your diet. So the traditional Western diet is going to be high in fat, processed sugar, processed carbohydrates, low in fibre, and we're going to see an increase in things like the Firmicutes, Proteobacteria, Mollicutes, Bacteroides, and a variety of other bacteria, which are not so helpful in terms of our health. And it will actually reduce some of the beneficial bacteria like the Bacteroidetes, Prevotella, Lactobacillus, Rosaburia, and various other bacteria that are positive in terms of health and will help to reduce. So this is if we're eating a lot of ultra-processed foods, it will reduce the amount of short-chain fatty acids we can produce. It will also increase that LPS, so the lipopolysaccharides that cause inflammation and damage that gut-blood barrier. So we get more of the unhelpful stuff like the bad bacteria leaking into our bloodstream then. Something called TMAO, which stands for trimethylamine nitric oxide, which is a chemical compound linked to cardiovascular disease and kidney damage. which is produced in the gut when certain foods are digested. And inflammatory cytokines. So again, cytokines are kind of an immune molecule, and if you have too many of them, it can produce an over response in the immune system, leading to additional inflammation, which is unhelpful. So all of these changes increase risk for nutrition-related long-term conditions, things like obesity and type 2 diabetes. Whereas the opposite, the whole foods, plant-based kind of diet, rich in whole grains, fruits and vegetables, had the opposite effects on the bacterial composition. So it reduced those opportunistic or pathological bacteria, and it reduced that LPS, reduced TMAO, and reduced the inflammatory cytokines. It increased production of short-chain fatty acids, reducing inflammation and therefore reducing the risk of those long-term chronic conditions. So we can be very clear, in terms of guidance for clients, participants, whoever's interested in, we're talking to about this, that, the kind of foods that are likely to reduce gut health and cause dysbiosis, give GI symptoms, are all these ultra-processed type foods, the highly refined carbohydrates, the sugar, solid fats, trans fats, all of these kind of things. Whereas eating a whole food diet, high in plants, high in a variety of different plant foods, lots of different fibers and fructooligosaccharides, is going to have this positive effect in overall health and particularly gut health. So more can be better when we're talking about wider variety of plant foods. So a higher dietary variety score, so they've come up with Huang et al. In 2022, came up with a kind of scoring mechanism and concluded that higher variety of different plant foods was definitely rated as healthier. So fiber-rich foods, but also things like poultry, fruits, low-fat cheeses, vegetables, berries, fruits, were associated with a greater microbial diversity, more of the beneficial bacteria, fewer of the pathogenic bacteria, and more potential to produce short-chain fatty acids. So hopefully that's been interesting to you, having a bit of a deeper dive on what we can do with our diet and nutrition that will have a positive impact, or understanding what's going on throughout the gut and have an impact on gut health overall. In the fourth part, we're going to have more of a focus on practical strategies that we can use to improve gut health, but it will build on what we've talked about here. See you then. Welcome to this final part of the gut health webinar. And this section is a bit shorter than the others, and really just to reiterate or highlight some practical strategies that you can use and you can share with your clients within your scope of practice that will help to improve gut health and therefore improve your own health as well. So in terms of the key strategies, the ones that have the strongest evidence base behind them that we can put into practice, the first one is to consume those probiotic foods on a regular basis. So we don't have to go crazy over it, but eating things like yogurt, kefir, maybe some kimchi or sauerkraut, some of these other fermented foods in the diet as a part of our daily routine is going to help to increase the amount of those healthy bacteria and other kind of microorganisms, which will then help to improve that variety and number of microorganisms in the gut. So some probiotic foods on a regular basis. It's also about what you don't have. So we all enjoy, eating some foods that are high in fat, sugar, probably ultra processed from time to time, but trying to avoid making those a main part of your day-to-day eating pattern. And we know this is a challenge for a lot of people in the UK. Over half of the UK population, food consumed and bought on a regular basis is ultra-processed foods. In America, it's even higher, the amount of ultra-processed foods that are bought and consumed. So we know that a lot of people are having these as the mainstay of their eating pattern. If we want to improve the health of our gut, we want to try and move away from being heavily reliant on these ultra-processed foods that are high in sugar, high in refined carbohydrates, and other additives and go towards more whole food alternatives. Which leads us on to talking about fruit and veg. And really, you know, there's no mystery here, is there? It's very basic, standard advice. But eating a wide variety of different plant foods, particularly different fruits and vegetables, trying to obtain, you know, I love the little analogy, you know, eat a rainbow. Try and eat a rainbow every day. Try and get foods that are different colours in terms of your fruits and vegetables and so on, because that will provide you with lots of different phytonutrients that will therefore be able to kind of support good health. And one thing that might be a shift for some of us or for some of your clients would be to try and move towards a slightly more plant-based diet. So as I've said before, it doesn't mean having to forego all animal products or give up meat or anything like that. But what it does mean is maybe trying to substitute some of the meat that you might be reliant on, particularly things like processed meats, which are less good for us anyway. But, you know, trying to replace some of those with non-meat protein sources like beans, pulses, maybe tofu, those kind of things, which again, we know are going to be better for those gut bacteria, are going to promote better gut health, and also focusing on whole grains. So perhaps, you know, very low carbohydrate diets, keto style diets may have some disadvantages in terms of the balance of gut microbiota as well. So trying to get a variety of different plant foods, yes, fruit and vegetables, also whole grains, beans, nuts, seeds, all of these different things will, you know, improve overall the balance and variety of different gut microorganisms. So those were the things that have really got some decent evidence behind them. These other considerations are things that perhaps are being promoted or touted on social media by so-called kind of gut health experts as being, oh, really important, you've got to do this for your gut. The reality is there isn't a lot of evidence behind them. They're not that substantiated. So maybe they're saying this because they just run out of things to say, because actually there's not that much to say in terms of what's good for your gut health. Get your probiotics, get your fibre, eat a wide variety of plant sources, pretty much as good as you can get right now. So, you know, they're looking for other things to say. These are going to make very small difference, if any, but things like mindful eating, you know, they're not harmful. You know, they're not going to do you any harm. They're generally quite a good thing to do anyway in terms of appetite regulation. Do they really help gut health? I don't think there's enough evidence to say that they do or don't, but, you know, they're not going to hurt. So eating without distractions to, you know, to kind of be more mindful of the quantity you're eating can certainly be very helpful in terms of portion control and weight management. Eating more slowly so that you're kind of chewing properly might help to digest food a little bit better, although the evidence for that is very, very weak. And, you know, again, it's just more of a strategy for slowing down your eating. Perhaps it will avoid eating so much or taking so much air in when you eat, which can be a cause for some people of excess gas. So if people are kind of, you know, very burpy or flatulent, it can be because they're rushing their food and taking a lot of air in with it. So actually just kind of slowing down your eating can be a helpful strategy for many other reasons, but maybe not so much on the gut health, but it might help. One of the things that is going to be really, really important if people are trying to eat more fibre, that is going to affect the function of your digestive system, particularly your large intestine. So if you're not used to a high fibre diet and you suddenly try and increase your fibre intake, that's going to have one of two effects, you know, one of two ways, isn't it? Either it's going to block you up and you're going to get really uncomfortable and a bit constipated, or it's going to go the other way and it's going to irritate the lining of your large intestine and you're going to have really loose stools. So to avoid that, we want to gradually increase fibre intake. And also one of the things that helps when you take on more fibre is to take on more water, more fluid. So healthy fluids also increasing alongside fibre intake gradually will help to maintain a healthier gut and avoid gastrointestinal discomfort and dysbiosis as well. People sometimes notice that some foods or types of foods cause them a bit of an upset stomach. So one way or another, it makes them feel uncomfortable, whether more bloated or, a bit more blocked up or, a bit looser, whatever it might be. So again, keeping a bit of a track or a monitor of that, something like a food diary and a symptom diary would be helpful, because it may be that, someone is a little bit more sensitive to certain types of fiber, or maybe their gut microbiome is kind of knocked a bit out of balance if they eat too much of a certain type of food, particularly maybe, a lot of sweets, a lot of sugary food could then disrupt their guts for a few days. So when we're thinking about athletes particularly, and maybe endurance athletes in particular, who are using carbohydrate supplements, things like sports drinks, energy gels, those kinds of products, on top of, maybe some of the GI symptoms that are already there as a result of the intense exercise, that could really make things pretty uncomfortable or unpleasant for them and actually impact on their performance. So having a close eye on certain products and trying different types of products, and also experimenting with foods and different types of foods before certainly training, in recovery, those kind of things can be really helpful strategically, not just for general health and well-being, but for performance for athletes. Because if you know what you can eat reliably that is not going to upset your stomach, is going to make you feel comfortable when you're racing and competing, and you don't have to worry about it, it's one less thing in the back of your mind, then no doubt you're going to perform better. So again, tracking, monitoring your food intake and monitoring symptoms, and then experimenting, by removing certain foods from the diet, adding certain foods back in, see what happens is the best strategy for that. And that relates to what we were talking about earlier, maybe with the FODMAPs. So where some people can be quite sensitive to those. So again, kind of some of those types of foods might be the ones to keep an eye on there. Outside of just what we're eating, there are other factors that influence gut health as well, which is what we said, why this area is quite hard to research, because you can't control all of the many, many variables. But we know, that the exercise, again, although it's quite a complicated area, we've got a pretty good idea now that moderate to vigorous aerobic exercise is associated with an improved diversity and number of gut bacteria, so that kind of microbiota. Whereas perhaps being sedentary, obviously not great for your health anyway, so good, do some more exercise, but also those very high intensity sessions or prolonged exercise sessions endurance athletes might be doing, those could be causing some dysbiosis there as well. So exercise, the sweet spot for health and well-being, somewhere in the middle. Sleep, did mention earlier this kind of relationship between some of the bacteria creating or producing metabolites that might influence or impair our sleep-wake cycle. And that kind of goes both ways, as with all of these relationships, it's a symbiotic relationship with the gut bacteria. So, if we can get into, and again, interestingly, from kind of observational data, things like Whoop, some of the outcomes of that indicate that the best thing you can do to improve the quality and quantity of your sleep is to establish a regular sleep-wake cycle. So it seems to be that, the most important factor, apart from all the other sleep hygiene factors, but actually waking up at the same time within, 30 minutes or so each day would be one of the best things you can do to help you then get into a regular sleep-wake cycle. So that then might help to improve the balance of the gut bacteria. That then might make it easier to keep to that sleep-wake cycle. So again, that kind of virtuous cycle, the one helps the other. We haven't talked very much about the autonomic nervous system, which is surprising to me. I'm a bit obsessed with it. So the balance of your autonomic nervous system, this kind of how much of the time are you spending in a very sympathetically driven state? So the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system being that kind of fight, flight or fright response where, the foot's down on the accelerator. Fantastic when you're exercising or when you're under physical threat. just what your body needs to kind of give it a big kickstart and get you going, all those adrenaline, catecholamine hormones racing around your system. However, chronic stress, we know, is associated with low-grade inflammation, is associated with long-term conditions and lots of other problems. Same thing, for that gut microbiota. If we've got chronic low-grade stress, that also is going to affect the lining of the gut, more LPS. So again, that's not going to be great in terms of those pathogenic bacteria and other things getting into the system. But it's also going to maybe create less of a friendly environment in the gut for the bacteria that we want to be there. So so managing our stress to spend a good balance of time in a parasympathetically dominant state, so a rest and digest, as it's called, state, that is going to be helpful in terms of our gut. More blood flowing to the gut lining, more nutrients getting down there. That's going to help, again, to feed those bacteria and create a healthier environment for them. So again, stress management is an important factor of what we can do with our clients that will help their gut bacteria. And if people do smoke, again, heavy drinking, use of recreational drugs, anything like that, then obviously stopping that or reducing it dramatically is going to have a big impact on overall health, but will definitely impact the environment there in the gut as well. So it's going to make it a healthier environment for our gut bacteria. So these are some of the other things outside of what we're eating that we can do to help create a healthy gut. In summary then, we should now be fairly familiar, and you have got your manual there, you can go back to that, read through these things in a little bit more detail. There are tables that summarize some things in detail that I haven't gone into in these presentations. But you should have a pretty good awareness now of what gut health is, the key terminology around that, and how our gut health interacts with our own health and well-being, and how it might influence sports performance as well. We've had a look at how exercise affects the gut, but also how the gut helps with exercise, so that bidirectional relationship. We understand that the research is a little bit uncertain there, or it shows different things, but there is definitely an association. We've also seen, obviously, how diet affects gut health. What we're putting into that environment is what is going to create the environment effectively for those microbiota to live in. So that's going to have a big impact. We're aware of the signs and symptoms, the dysbiosis, the gut problems, and we've just had a look at some kind of practical strategies or methods that we can put into action for ourselves and for our clients that will help to improve gut health and therefore overall health and well-being. So all that remains is for me to say thank you very much for taking the time out to watch these videos. I hope it's been useful in helping to break down perhaps some of that information that is there for you in the manual as well. And I look forward to seeing you in your next live session. Take care.